I want to begin by being careful about my own title, because I walked through China's new economy and nothing prepared me, and the West has no idea is a set of phrases that can be read in ways I do not intend. And the ways I do not intend would make the whole reflection worthless, so let me foreclose them at once. When I say nothing prepared me, I do not mean that I was ignorant beforehand, that I went uninformed, that I had not done the reading. I had read extensively for years, and I knew the facts and the figures and the narratives as well as anyone who studies these things from a distance, right? So nothing prepared me is not a confession of prior ignorance. And when I say the West has no idea, I want to be absolutely clear that I do not mean it as an insult to Western intelligence, and I do not mean it as a claim of Chinese supremacy or Western decline. And I am not interested in either the triumphalism or the self-flagellation that surrounds so much of this subject. What I mean by both of these phrases is something more precise and I think far more interesting, and it is an epistemological point, a point about the limits of a particular kind of knowing, and it is this. There are certain realities that cannot be transmitted through any representation, that can only be known by direct experience. And because the West knows China almost entirely through representations, and because the realities that matter most are precisely the ones representation cannot carry, the West genuinely has no idea of them, not out of stupidity, but because the reality is of a kind that no representation can convey. Nothing prepared me because no representation could have, and the West has no idea because the West has representations and the reality is untransmittable. That is the whole of what I want to develop, and it is a point about knowing itself far more than a point about China. Let me be careful, as always, about the two extremes, because this subject pulls people hard toward one of them, and both are wrong. The first extreme is the triumphalist narrative, the reading of Nothing Prepared Me and the West Has No Idea as a story of Chinese ascendancy and Western obliviousness in some competitive contest. And this is wrong, both because it misreads what I am pointing at, which is a limit of representation rather than a national judgment, and because it imports a hostility and a scorekeeping that obscure the actual observation. And the second extreme is the comfortable dismissal, the insistence that reading is sufficient, that the facts are the facts and direct experience adds nothing but atmosphere, that a person well informed by representations knows the thing as well as a person who has walked through it. This is the more common error among sophisticated people, and it is the more dangerous because it is precisely the confusion of representation with reality that leaves the untransmittable unknown. The truth is neither triumphalism nor dismissal. The truth is that some realities are untransmittable through representation, that anyone relying only on representation is systematically uninformed about exactly those realities, and that this is a universal epistemological limit, not a national failing, one that would apply equally to anyone relying only on representation of anything. So let me start with the central point, the poverty of representation, because everything depends on it and it is worth developing carefully. A representation is a compression. Words, numbers, images, even video are all representations, and every representation is a compression of the reality it represents, a reduction of the full thing to a set of features that can be encoded and transmitted. And a compression, by its nature, keeps some things and loses others. It keeps the features that can be encoded, the facts, the quantities, the appearances, the things that can be reduced to symbols and numbers and pictures, and it loses the features that cannot be encoded. And here is the crucial thing. There are features of reality that cannot be encoded, that are not the kind of thing a representation is made of. And these features are systematically lost in every representation, no matter how detailed or how accurate the representation is. And the features that are lost are not trivial or merely atmospheric. They include some of the most consequential qualities a reality can have: the felt experience of scale, the density of a living ecosystem, the momentum of a place in motion, the texture of being physically present in a thing. These are not conveyed by any representation, however good. because they are not the kind of thing a representation can carry. And this is the poverty of representation, that the most consequential qualities of certain realities are precisely the ones that no representation transmits. And this is why nothing prepared me. I had all the representations, I had the facts and the figures and the images and the reports, and every one of them was a compression that had kept the encodable features and lost exactly the ones that would hit me when I walked through the thing. The felt scale, the density, the momentum, the texture. The representations had told me it was large. They had given me the numbers, the square footage, and the rail speeds, and the output figures. But no number had transmitted what large actually feels like from inside, standing in it, moving through it, because the felt experience of scale is not a number and cannot be compressed into one. And so it had been lost in every representation I had ever consumed, and it was waiting for me, untransmitted, when I finally walked through the thing itself. Nothing prepared me, not because I was uninformed, but because the thing that hit me was exactly the thing that no representation had carried. The untransmittable quality that all the abundant information had systematically lost. The principles that determine how to know the limits of your own knowing, how to hold representation-based knowledge with the appropriate humility and to weight direct experience where it matters, are worth studying deliberately and as a connected whole. And there is a body of work that lays them out carefully, called the Naval Codex. It is not a travelogue, and it is not a set of tactics. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who sees reality accurately, including the reality that representation cannot carry, rather than mistaking the abundance of their representations for genuine knowledge of the thing. If you want to engage with those principles directly, it is linked in the description, and there's a code on the screen you can scan to reach it. And engaging with the principles directly is what matters, because the humility about representation generalizes far beyond any single place, and the realities it applies to will always be different. Now let me develop the collective consequence. The part captured in the West has no idea, because it follows directly and it is the part most easily misread. The West is not ignorant of the facts about China. It has abundant facts, more facts than any observer could process, an overwhelming quantity of information, reports and analyses and data and images. But facts are representations, and representations are compressions. And the reality that matters most, the felt scale and the density and the momentum and the trajectory experienced viscerally rather than known as a number, is precisely the untransmittable reality that the compressions have lost. And so the West, knowing China only through its representations, however abundant, genuinely has no idea of the reality the representations fail to carry, not because the West is unintelligent and not because the information is inadequate, but because the reality is of a kind that no quantity of representation can convey. This is the crucial thing, and it is why the phrase is not an insult. The West has no idea, in exactly the way that anyone relying only on representation of anything has no idea of the untransmittable qualities of that thing. It is a structural limit of representation-only knowing, and it would be equally true of a Chinese observer knowing the West only through representations, and equally true of anyone, anywhere, knowing any reality only through its compressions. It is not a national judgment. It is an epistemological fact about the poverty of representation applied to a case where the untransmittable qualities happen to be enormous. Let me apply this to the dimension that connects most directly to how you are positioned, which is the monetary one, because walking through China made real to me an untransmittable reality that I had only ever known as representation, and it changed how I understood my own position. I had known, as a fact, as a representation, that China operates a comprehensive parallel financial and payment system independent of the arrangement that anchors most of the world's transactions. I knew this the way one knows a fact from a report, but walking through it, transacting within it, experiencing for 10 days the completeness of a monetary and financial world that operated entirely without reference to the system I had assumed was universal, transmitted a reality that no report had carried, the felt completeness of a genuine alternative, the visceral experience of a parallel system that simply worked entirely on its own terms, And this untransmittable experience did something the representations never had. It made real to me the concentration of my own position, the totality of my dependence on a single system that I had assumed was universal, precisely because I had only ever known the alternative as a representation and never as a lived reality. The representation of the alternative had left my assumption of universality intact. The experience of it destroyed the assumption because it made the alternative real in a way no representation had. The way capital actually moves as parallel systems become real rather than merely represented, where it flows and why, and what happens to those who knew the alternatives only as representation versus those who grasped their reality, is worth understanding in its specific mechanics rather than in vague outline, and there is a framework that traces exactly this, called the Dragon Pivot. Despite the name, it is not really about any single country. It is about how the monetary order shifts, how the alternatives move from representation to reality, and how those who grasped the reality early positioned themselves before the shift became undeniable. You can reach it through the code shown on the screen or through the link in the description for anyone who wants the fuller picture. And that picture matters here precisely because the reality of the monetary alternatives is exactly the kind of thing that representation fails to carry, so that those who know it only as a fact from a report have, in the sense I have been describing, no idea of it, while those who grasp its reality can position accordingly. This brings me to what you actually do once a reality becomes real to you rather than merely represented, because the entire value of grasping the untransmittable is in what it lets you do. Once the reality of where genuine productive capability is accumulating becomes real to you, not as a fact from a report, but as a grasped reality, you are compelled to reposition to own genuine productive capability rather than the fragile financial claims that a representation-bound analysis missing the untransmittable reality would leave you holding. The person who grasps the reality owns genuine productive assets positioned for a world they have actually understood. The person who knows only the representations holds the fragile claims that the representations missing the reality made seem safe. The work of building a position out of genuine productive capability, grounded in the reality of where durable value accumulates rather than in the representations that miss it, is worth doing systematically, and there is a framework devoted precisely to that called the Sovereign Vault. It is concerned with building durable, generationally significant wealth, grounded in real productive assets and real institutional protection, the kind of position that follows from grasping the reality rather than from consuming the representations, rather than in the fragile arrangements that a representation-bound view mistakes for safety. It is linked below, and the code on the screen will take you straight to it for anyone who wants to go deeper on the question of what a position grounded in reality rather than representation actually holds. And that is the practical core of it, because grasping the untransmittable reality means little if you remain out of the habits of a representation-bound view, holding exactly the claims that the reality would counsel against. Now, I want to turn to the deepest point, the one beneath the specific observation, and it is about a confusion that runs through almost all of modern life, and that the whole reflection illuminates, which is the confusion of representation with reality. Most people, most of the time, confuse their representations for reality. They believe that because they have the facts, they know the thing, that because they have consumed the reports and the images and the data, they have grasped the reality. And this confusion, the mistaking of the map for the territory, is precisely what leaves the untransmittable reality unknown. Because a person who believes their representations are reality has no reason to seek the reality the representations have lost. And this confusion is deepening, not lessening, in a world increasingly mediated by representation. We live more and more through screens, through feeds, through data, through compressions of reality delivered to us at a distance. And the more of our knowing is mediated by representation, the more we mistake the representation for the reality, and the wider the gap grows between what we think we know, which is the representations, and what is actually the case, which includes the untransmittable realities the representations have lost. The West has no idea, in this deeper sense, not only about China, but about a great many realities, because the West, like everyone, increasingly knows the world through representations and mistakes, the representations for the world, and the untransmittable realities, the felt scale and density and momentum and texture of things, go increasingly unknown as the mediation deepens. And this points to the practical lesson, which is genuinely important, which I want to state carefully, because it would be easy to draw the wrong one. The lesson is not that you must go and directly experience everything, because you cannot, because no one can directly experience more than a tiny fraction of the realities that matter to their decisions. The lesson is subtler and more useful. It is that you must hold your representation-based knowledge with humility, knowing that it systematically fails to carry certain realities, that the abundance of your facts is not the same as knowledge of the thing, and that the comfortable conclusions you have drawn from representations alone about things you have never directly encountered are precisely the conclusions most likely to be wrong about the untransmittable qualities that matter most. And it is that you must weight direct experience heavily when you can get it, seek it where the stakes are high, and be especially skeptical of the settled confidence you feel about realities, only through their compressions. For investing, in particular, this lesson has a sharp edge, because the untransmittable realities where genuine productive capability and genuine momentum actually are exactly the things that representation-bound analysis misses, which is why those who go and see gain a genuine edge over those who only read, not because they have more information, but because they have grasped a reality that no quantity of information could have transmitted. I want to think honestly about why people trust representation and do not seek reality, why the West and everyone will continue to mistake the map for the territory, because understanding the mechanism is the only defense against it. The first reason is the comfort and the cheapness of representation. You can consume representations from your chair at no cost and no effort in unlimited quantity. And the sheer availability and ease of representation makes it the default, while direct experience is costly and effortful and limited. The second reason is the illusion of knowing that facts provide, that having the facts feels like knowing the thing, so that the person who has consumed the representations experiences themselves as informed, as knowledgeable, as someone who understands, and this felt sense of knowing removes the very motive that would drive them to seek the reality the representations have lost. And the third reason, the deepest, is the human tendency to mistake the map for the territory, which is not a modern failing, but an ancient one, rooted in the way the mind works with symbols and merely amplified by a modern environment that delivers more representation and less reality than any environment before it. People trust their representations not because they have concluded that representations are adequate, but because representations are cheap, and the illusion of knowing is comfortable, and the confusion of map and territory is deep. And so they consume the compressions and mistake them for the thing, and the untransmittable realities go unknown. I want to be very clear about what I am not saying, because the misreadings here are dangerous, and I want to foreclose them completely. The West has no idea is not West bashing, and it is not China worship, and it is not a claim of Western decline or Chinese supremacy. It is an epistemological point about the poverty of representation, universal in its application, that would be equally true of any observer knowing any reality only through its compressions. And I want to acknowledge, as I always do, that the West, and America in particular, retains genuine and durable strengths that are real and that I do not dismiss. And this reflection is not a verdict on any contest between civilizations. It is a point about knowing, and nothing prepared me is not a claim that I was ignorant beforehand, because I was well informed by representations. And the entire point is that representations, however abundant, cannot carry the untransmittable, so that being well informed by representation and being unprepared for the reality are perfectly compatible, and were, in my case, exactly what occurred. So I want to end, as I always do, not with an exhortation, but with an invitation to see clearly, because this is, in the end, one of the oldest pieces of wisdom there is, and it is not new. The map is not the territory. Representations systematically fail to carry certain realities, the felt and the lived and the untransmittable. And the person who mistakes the map for the territory, who believes that having the representations is knowing the thing, is precisely the person who remains ignorant of the realities the representations have lost. This is not new. What is new is only the specific circumstance, a particular reality whose untransmittable qualities happen to be enormous, and a particular modern environment that delivers more representation and less reality than any before it, deepening the confusion of map and territory even as the untransmittable realities grow. Nothing prepared me, because nothing could, and the West has no idea. Not because it lacks the facts, but because the reality is of a kind that facts cannot carry. That is the thing I most want to leave you with, and the remedy is not despair and it is not scorn. It is humility about representation and the courage to seek the reality. Hold your compressions lightly, knowing what they have lost. Wait, direct experience, where the stakes are high. Be most skeptical of the confident conclusions you have drawn about realities you have only ever known as representation. And grasp, where you can, the reality that no representation carries, because it is exactly that reality, the untransmittable one, that the representation-bound miss, and that those who grasp it can act on. And the value of grasping it invisible for a long time, the way these things always are, through the stretch in which the representation-bound feel perfectly informed, and the person who grasped the reality appears merely to be insisting on something the facts already covered, reveals itself the way these things always reveal themselves, which is slowly in the quiet accumulation of decisions grounded in a reality that most people never grasped, and then suddenly, at the moment, the untransmittable reality finally forces itself even upon those who knew only the representations, and the people who grasped it early, who understood that the map was never the territory, are found to have been, all along, simply the ones who went and saw what no representation could carry.